Hello and welcome to this short video where we will introduce the new book Multispecies Storytelling in Intermedial Practices.
Okay, so multi-species storytelling is a kind of tentative proposal or hesitant but also feel radical proposal to think about the kind of semantic and semiotic and linguistic faculties that lie beyond the kind of human speech or language, and to think of ways that we can sort of include those in the stories that we tell about the world. Trying to broaden out the very idea of what it means to have language, and also kind of decenter the idea of human language as the kind of sole communication tool in the world, as that tool of communication that our humanistic also and scientific knowledge is centered around. So really, it's a kind of playful and speculative endeavor to broaden out the idea of language and who has language and who has narrative capabilities.
I mean, intermediate practices here is a very kind of open term, meaning simply that the questions that I think you described nicely, Ida, are pursued in a lot of different media types. So we have a kind of human and non-human communication in flower arrangements, in cockroaches eating and shitting on Kafka short story. We have a kind of activism, almost a kind of manifest text on dancing for plants and making that as a kind of a resource, ironically, a kind of resource addition. So that it's a very heterogeneous and rich field of different ways of creating ways of seeing these new areas of cohabitation and collaboration that we perhaps tended earlier. Some of us, not so much Ida, but I perhaps did earlier before I went into this, tended to silo into different sectors. And both the conference and the book, as a result of that, is a very, very rich kind of conglomerate of different perspectives, different theories, different methods that investigates new possibilities. And I think your terms, Ida, of it being a playful and speculative way, catches it very, very nicely.
Okay, so to sum up, when you say multi-species, you are aiming to include perspectives other than the human. And when you say intermedial practices, you're aiming to include other forms of expression than human language.
Both human language and different ways of expressing and being in the world, using all sorts of sign and meaning making, we could say, perhaps. But also it refers also more traditionally, I would say, from our point of view, from our intermediate research center in Växjö, it also refers simply to different kind of mostly artistic media types. So it has to do with arts, visual arts, literature, performing arts. So it's also kind of just the kind of different artistic possibilities that the media types offered.
I think that is a good way of saying it, and I think that also what is really important here is that it's not just, and I say not just, a question of introducing non-human perspectives on the storytellings and the way that we make meaning of the world, but it's also a question of rethinking what the human is and how the human communicates. So also kind of introducing all of those, let's say, more somatic and more embodied communication tools that we're utilizing and that we're also sharing with other non-human agents, and with which we engage. We always engage. We are in a constant and perpetual conversation, of course, with our surroundings. But the thing is that our sciences and the language we use to make sense of the world is not always very good at kind of capturing those processes of communication. So it's also a question of not just inventing sort of new tools, but also looking at the ways that we're already embedded within these communicative processes and kind of broadening up our scientific language that can capture and reflect upon these. I think that is really difficult to answer that question, because I feel like the editing process has started from a different point of view or a different perspective. So I don't think that it has not been a big part of the editorial conversation, how much we should have, like how many artistic approaches versus how many scientific approaches we should include. But I think a more kind of organic way of establishing those contacts and kind of creating a space where scholars and artists were able to meet and also were able to unfold, maybe, let's say, again, more playful or less conventional ways of exploring these themes, because it is speculative, because we don't really know we don't necessarily know what lies beyond this human language or linguistic faculties, because it is such a kind of it's such a kind of old untold realm that we're entering into. I think just holding that space open for exploration and also experimental exploration has been really important in the editorial process. So I'm not sure how to answer that question, but I feel like my gut reaction says that it's like very much like a 50-50 position, and then also everything in between. But maybe you, Jørgen, have something to add to that.
Yes, I do. This is by far the most experimental book that I've been editing, I can say. And I've had some questions during the process, also sometimes to myself and many times to you, Ida, concerning kind of the borders of what I would normally, from conventional, much more conventional kind of academic position, would, in a sense, allow, perhaps. But I quickly learned also when the contributions came in and we started reading, and in a few instances came with some kind of suggestions and in the active editing process. It wasn't so strange as I thought it was, perhaps. I think both you and Ida experienced readers and editors in some sense, and I mean there's some sense of quality. I think some kind of I think we perhaps shared. So I think there were a few times when we had to discuss some editorial questions. Most of the time we were on the same line, actually, because I think we both could recognize from our different points of view, anyway, what was, so to speak, what worked, what was good, what was argued in a good way, even though not always the argumentation would be what would be accepted in a conventional, let's say, a literary review or something like that. But the quality is very high, but the conventions directing these texts are more diverse than would normally be the case, and that's an interesting thing and a rewarding thing. So I learned a lot about being confronted with these ways of writing and thinking, definitely. Yeah, I mean, both working with Ida and working with the text, so to speak, has taught me something about some kind of fearlessness, perhaps, not being too nervous about overstepping conventional lines. It has learned me something, I think, about creativity and radicality also. Many of the contributions here actually would in some academic traditions be considered too activist, too normative, too much making a kind of ideological argument, you could say. And sometimes we, in academia, we want to avoid that. In our case, we more, I think, Ida, I think you agree that we more took it in actively, and then we still ask people to, of course, to argue thoroughly for their cases, to refer to the right, what the authors would find the right texts or the right practices, or arguing by way of photographs in some sense, in some instances. Yeah. So I think I learned something about flexibility and also possible innovation.
Working with within academia, or collaborating with academic bodies such as yours is really a way of learning how to organize knowledge and also communicate knowledge in ways that that also demand a kind of the demand that we learn how to put words and how to do we learn how to articulate some of those like ideas, wild ideas that are happening and that are generated within these fields, artistic fields. And I feel that that's also something we have achieved with this book, is to create a platform and start a conversation. I think we all need this knowledge. And of course, this is not complete knowledge to be gained. There is no complete knowledge or complete perspectives to kind of, take from this book, but there are a lot of suggested entry points into a really large and extremely important conversation that also goes beyond this question of language and multi-species storytelling, which is really about reformulating and repositioning the human position in the world, and the kind of anthropocentric ontologies and epistemologies that are very, very much guiding our ways of being in, at least in the global north, I want to say. So I think that we all need to engage these questions. I think that the book also offers a lot of different entry points. So whether you're an artist or whether you're an academic, whether you are none of those, but just simply like a concerned and interested citizen of the world, I think that there are things to be that you can take from this book.
Several of the texts would, without any problem, be read and understood and appreciated or criticized by the so-called lay reader. There would be entrances for many different positions here. I think there are historical material. There are actually also futuristic, speculative material here. There's playful reorganizations of human, non-human aspects. There are very kind of high-tech considerations concerning how to approach actually wildlife in nature, how to capture that, for instance, by certain video surveillance technologies. There are lots of different entrances here, I believe. But one of the references that actually turned out to pop up in several of the essays is a very old reference, a very general reference from von Uexküll, the idea, a very general kind of a non-anthropomorph idea that the world looks and appears differently from different species point of view, so to speak. To put it very basically, perhaps, I think that's what the book is about.
Because we all need to remake our vocabularies and open up our perspectives on what counts as stories, and how we can story differently and make meaning differently within this very fragile world that we're inhabiting and co-inhabiting with so many others.
Thank you very much. And the book is, of course, available both to buy in physical form, but also to download for free from the internet, and we'll provide a link to that here in the video. Thank you very much for joining me in this short introduction of your new book, and congratulations.
Thank you, Isine.
Thank you so much.